When we invest in ourselves, we all shine. Together, we are Black beyond measure.
I really do get a kick out of every year around Dr. King's birthday, the federal holiday, and we get treated with all the quotes and all the laudatory comments about how amazing Dr. King was and what he stood for and what he did for America. And then the same folk then turn around and literally vote against, speak against the very things that he actually fought for. And so Sunday night, I had some followers of mine who sent me a sermon by Houston's Ed Young Sr., who leads Second Baptist Church. And Ed Young is one of the most prominent white conservative preachers in the country. Second Baptist has several locations in Houston. His son has a massive church in North Texas, and he's one of the biggest voices among the conservative Christian movement. And lately he has been highly critical of progressive policies and the left, and criticizing, lying about Houston, saying Houston has the highest crime rate in the country. That was a lie. Telling folks we should be opposing cash bail. I mean, all kind of BS from the pulpit, constantly lying. He's been checked by Houston Mayor Sylvester Turner on several occasions as well. But he gave a sermon called Created Equal, and I listened to it, and I had to get a laugh out of it as I watched him go through it, and with the praise of Dr. King. And so I just wanted to just begin to break this thing down. So why don't I go ahead and play it, and I'm gonna start it and stop it and walk y'all through some of the nonsense that we heard from him that we often hear from other white conservative preachers who make the same mistake in terms of trying to look all good with racial reconciliation and speaking against racism. But it's amazing how they ignore a lot of other stuff that happens. But go ahead, let's start it right now.
Yesterday, I went back and I looked at 400 years of life in America for the African American who was brought over here as slaves. I sort of knew all that, but I didn't have any concept of the length of the bigotry, the prejudice,
get ready to stop it,
the inhumane way Americans treated fellow human beings made in the image of God. Because if you know your history, slaves first came over here in 1619, and I do not buy the 1619 phony history. That's not what I'm saying. But they came.
Stop right there. Stop right there. Stop right there. First of all, Ed Young, y'all, is 86 years old. He was born in Mississippi. He pastored in South Carolina. How in the hell are you unaware of the treatment of African Americans in the United States? You were born and raised in Mississippi. Really? Now, y'all notice right there how he mentioned the first slaves coming in 1619, and then I don't mean that phony 1619 history project. Notice how he slid that in, okay? See, this is what they do. See, their anger is at Nicole Hannah-Jones and all the other folks who participated in that, because what folk like Ed Young don't like is the rest of the story. They don't want you to hear. And so maybe, Ed, the reason you didn't fully understand the depths and the treatment of Africa, how African Americans were being treated, because the 1619 Project didn't exist. Maybe because you were presented a whitewashed version of American history. So as opposed to trying to throw shade at it, maybe you should spend some time reading that. Press play.
With the settlement of Jamestown, the Massachusetts Bay Company, and they came primarily for profit and for gold. A little later, we know about Plymouth Rock, when pilgrims came because they loved Jesus and they wanted to worship freely and independently in a new land. So a totally different ballgame. But in Jamestown, the secular invasion of our country, they brought with them slaves, first slavery in our history. And then we know from that moment, listen, roughly 250 years. Just hold on to that number. 250 years we treated fellow human beings made in the image of God as if they were animals, and sometimes worse than we treat our own animals.
Oh, I gotta put a pause there, Ed, because yes, slavery lasted about 243 years. You throw in the Civil War, then you got the Reconstruction period. But you might want to add on another 100 years, Ed. Great Compromise of 1866, the election of 1876 leads to the Great Compromise of 1877, which leads to 92 years of Jim Crow. Black folks in Jim Crow were treated like animals, were treated as less than human beings. Lynchings that took place in your home state of Mississippi, in South Carolina, where you were a pastor, in Alabama, in Tennessee, in Arkansas, and Texas, and on and on and on. So I'm trying to understand why you're only limiting this treatment of African Americans to that period of slavery when that treatment existed beyond slavery when it was over, or as Douglas Blackman called it, slavery without, first of all, it was slavery without shackles. Slavery continued, just weren't in shackles. Press play.
That's the truth. The Constitution was written by wealthy men, intelligent men, supposedly God-fearing men, but 8 out of the first.
Constitution was not written by wealthy men. It was written by wealthy white men. That distinction is kind of important to the conversation. Press play.
First 12 presidents of the United States were slave owners. They were slave owners. Now you can build all kind of little anonymous, how people treat their slaves like family and all that, but it is brutality and is evil any way you look at it. And now we see Dr. King came.
Stop. I'm sorry. We went from slavery to Dr. King. Damn near 100 years. Dr. King does not come onto the national consciousness until the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955. He literally went from the end of slavery to Dr. King. How you skip 90 years? How do you skip Frederick Douglass? How do you skip Martin Delany? How do you skip Booker T. Washington, W.B. Du Bois, A. Philip Randolph, Ida B. Wells Barnett? How do you skip 90 years of black struggle for freedom and you just go, ooh, then we got Dr. King? Press play.
And through prayer, he decided to bring about a revolution different from any other revolutions, except maybe when Mahatma Gandhi, through pacifism, liberated India from the British Empire through nonviolence. Dr. King took that path. It was dangerous. It was deadly. And he began through those years to do things, to say things, always in a biblical Christian context. Don't miss that.
He began to say things and do things. Ed, can we name some of them? I mean, the way it sounds like Dr. King just prayed and gave sermons. No, that was policy. There were things behind that. He was arrested. There were protests, and it wasn't just him. It was Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. It was Dr. Dorothy Height. It was James Farmer. It was Core. It was SNCC. It was a plethora of individuals. It was, I mean, we can go, it was Ella Baker and others. It was Roy Wilkins. It was Whitney Young. I mean, we can go on and on with the folks who were involved in this. Come on, Doc. Press play.
Don't miss that. Don't miss that. I submit to you that along with Billy Graham and maybe internationally Winston Churchill, Dr. Martin Luther King was the most influential individual in the 20th century by far.
But Ed, tell your white congregants why. Go deeper. Ed, come on. If you're going to walk through scripture, walk through the text and the life of Dr. King. Sitting right here, Ed. 7 volumes of Dr. King's writings. The papers of Martin Luther King Jr. from Stanford University, Claiborne Carson, and others. 7 volumes. And not even all of his papers. The books he read. Doc, you got to go a little bit deeper than that, player. Go ahead, press play.
He saved America. He preached the gospel. He was indeed a great man.
Dr. King did not save America because he preached the gospel. Dr. King and others redefined America because they chose to stand up and fight for freedom and equality and fight against white supremacy, fight for the poor, fight for the folks who have been ignored. He didn't just preach the gospel. The Bible, Ed, says faith without works is dead. You can't stand before your congregation and give a sermon about Dr. King's faith and ignore his works and not mention that. But there's a reason why you don't want to mention his works. Because his works then contradicts what you believe today. Press play.
Martin Luther King speaking at Southern Methodist University 2 years before his assassination, 1966. He said, a doctrine of black supremacy is just as dangerous as a doctrine of white supremacy. God is not interested in freedom of black men or brown men or yellow men. God is interested in the freedom of the whole human race, the creation of a society where every man will respect the dignity and worth of personality. Dr. King, a couple of years before his assassination at SMU.
Oh my God, I'm fascinated by Ed transitioning from Dr. King's work to a piece of his speech at Southern Methodist in 1966. So I decided to look up that particular speech. Go to my iPad. This, ladies and gentlemen, is a transcript of that particular speech. Ed talked about the white supremacy, the black supremacy part. Let me scroll down. Let me keep going. 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 Oh, then I have arrived right there at the top of the screen, the one paragraph that Ed Young was speaking about. Ladies and gentlemen, the speech that Dr. King gave is 7,485 words. Let me say that again, just in case you missed what I just said. The speech that Dr. King gave at Southern Methodist University is 7,485 words. Ed Young skipped 6,345 words before he decided to cherry pick the segment of Dr. King's speech where he's talking about black supremacy. Now, if anybody understands and actually has read the history of Dr. King, what they will know and understand is Dr. King, whenever you saw him talking about black supremacy, he was specifically talking about the Nation of Islam. He was talking about, here's his book, Where We Go From Here, Chaos or Community. In this particular book, where he talked about there are 4 institutions that are primed to liberate black America, he lists the Negro Church, the Negro Press, Negro fraternities and sororities, Negro professional and business organizations. And then he talks about the Nation of Islam, and he says, while he praises them for the work that they have done to clean up black men and to be moral and upstanding, he disagrees with them about black supremacy. That's what he was talking about. In the same book, he talked about black power being an empty statement with nothing behind it. That's what King talked about. You can hear numerous speeches with him doing so. But there's a reason why Ed mentioned, why he just cherry picks that part of King's speech at SMU for this.
So I submit to you that we're proud to be American. I'm proud to be American, but we can't overlook this disastrous history. At the same time, all important, the color of your faith says all of those in the woke agenda. What does that mean?
He said the woke agenda. Now you understand why he pulls out that segment on black supremacy, because it is the setup for the attack on the woke agenda. He then tries to define the woke agenda. Press play.
Means, according to those in the left part of our United States, that if you were born black or some other color, that defines who you are, and you are, listen to me carefully, automatically a racist by being white.
That is a fundamental and absolute lie. It is an absolute lie. That is not what being woke means. That is how white conservatives have redefined wokeness. They have used it as the attack against diversity, equity, and inclusion, the attack against multiculturalism, the attack against what we're trying to achieve. That's how they have redefined it in their own way. That is not the definition. Press play.
It doesn't matter what you've done, what you believe, where you've been. You are a racist by virtue of your birth. And more than that, and this is hard to believe, there's not a thing in the world you can ever do to repent and to convince anybody anywhere because you're white that you're not a racist.
We all know that's a flat out lie. We've had Jane Elliott on this show. We've had Tim Wise on this show. We've had others on this show. We know that there are white brothers and sisters who are involved in the fight for equality. That is simply not true. We know for a fact James Reed was beaten to death. A pastor from Boston was beaten there in Selma, standing up for voting rights. We know white woman Viola Liuzzo from Michigan had her head blown off coming back from Montgomery back to Selma. We know, again, that other white folks who were killed during the civil rights movement, and we know folk today who are involved in protests, who are on the front lines, who are not black. Sorry, Ed, Ed, you simply are wrong, and that's a flat out lie. But when you have your own definition of wokeness, now we understand why you were utterly confused. Hit play.
There's no redemption. You can be anti-racist, but you'll never reach the goal until you're still categorized like that. A leader of Black Lives Matter said, a matter of public record, anyone who waves an American flag by definition, whomever you are, you're a racist.
Now, it's amazing how you could go to find Dr. King's speech and go down 6,000 plus words and pluck out a paragraph, but you can't name who this so-called Black Lives Matter leader is. Do you have a name, Ed? Are they actually a Black Lives Matter leader? Who? Are they a local person? Are they a national leader? Who really is the person you're quoting, Ed, so we can have the context? Oh, you just say a Black Lives Matter leader, it's a matter of public record. Nice try. We ain't falling for the banana in the tailpipe. Press play.
Everything is tragically defined by racism. How different that is from Dr. Martin Luther King's understanding of the racial challenges we had in America then, and we progressed a great deal, but we still have some ways to go, but how far that we have come. You see, he would tell us, as we know, the color of your face doesn't determine your character and who you are, and really you'll discover doesn't say much about you and me. Did you know that all of our physical assets, ears, nose, mouth, body, make up 0.012 of who we are? Is that any big deal about you or about me? That color is all important of your skin? Huh.
Did he just... So Dr. King didn't understand color? Dr. King didn't have an appreciation of blackness? Really, Ed? I recall Dr. King talking about black is beautiful. Press play. Dr. King.
Go to Korea.
I come
Play
here
King.
tonight and plead with you. Believe in yourself and believe that you're somebody. As I said to the group last night, nobody else can do this for us. No document can do this for us. No Lincolnian Emancipation Proclamation can do this for us. No Kennedysonian or Johnsonian Civil Rights Bill can do this for us. If the Negro is to be free, he must move down into the inner resources of his own soul and sign with a pen and ink of self-assertive manhood his own Emancipation Proclamation. Don't let anybody take your manhood. Be proud of our heritage. As somebody said earlier tonight, we don't have anything to be ashamed of. Somebody told a lie one day. They couched it in language. They made everything black, ugly, and evil. Look in your dictionary and see the synonyms of the word black. It's always something degrading and low and sinister. Look at the word white. It's always something pure, high, and clean. But I want to get the language right tonight. Get the language so right that everybody here will cry out, yes, I'm black, I'm proud of it, I'm black and beautiful.
What MLK says right there absolutely contradicts Ed Young. But I need you to understand what Young is doing. Young wants to present this sanitized, this civil rights mascot view of King. He wants to strip Dr. King of his radicalness. He wants to take it away, and he wants to be somehow given credit for addressing the issue of race when, no, what you're doing is you are actually ignoring what King's life was actually all about, the issues he actually confronted and dealt with. If y'all watch the rest of this sermon, what you will hear Ed Young continuing and going on, talking about different aspects, talking about how God created one race. Absolutely. Oh, he'll mention how race is a construct, and he'll talk about that in a certain way. There's a certain point in his sermon where he talks about how the white supremacists are almost out of business mentioning the KKK. Really? FBI Director Christopher Wray testified before Congress. Play it. This is the FBI Director talking in the last couple of years. Listen.
The HVE threat, the homegrown violent extremist threat, is the new normal, and it's created a new set of challenges, a much greater number of potential threats, each with far fewer dots to connect, and much less time to prevent or disrupt an attack. These folks are largely radicalized online by the global jihadist movement. We're also keeping our eye on domestic terrorism from people who've come up with their own customized belief systems and hope to advance them through violence. We have, through the third quarter of this fiscal year, had about, give or take, 100 arrests in the international terrorism side, which includes the homegrown violent extremism. This year. But we've also had just about the same number, again, don't quote me to the exact digit, on the domestic terrorism side. And I will say that a majority of the domestic terrorism cases that we've investigated are motivated by some version of what you might call white supremacist violence, but it includes other things as well. It's a huge chunk.
Now, Ed Young, this idea that somehow we've eliminated that simply flies out the window because it's simply not true. But when you're living in your own safe, protected cocoon, and when you are standing with MAGA folk, you actually believe that utter nonsense when in fact, that's simply not true. Play this part of his sermon.
It's not biblical. Let me assure you of that, because without grace, we're totally out of business. So, with that being said, I'm going to do something with great reticence, but I think it needs to be restated. One of the greatest orations, Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, 2 or 3 others, would be Martin Luther King's I Had a Dream speech. There in the Washington Mall, maybe 1 million people present, millions of people heard it around the world. And Martin Luther King dreamed of a certain kind of America. I think we were getting there with not fast enough. 350 years of bigotry by leadership across the board is too much, folks. We can't deny that. We can't run from that. But we were getting there. And we're getting there because a lot of churches, Christians, that's how slavery got eliminated. In England, it was Wilberforce. And here it was Uncle Tom's Cabin. And here it was Henry Ward Beecher and others who stood against the evil and deadliness of racism. Oh yes, it was through the church when people awakened to see that in the Bible we are one in Jesus Christ, period, Selah. When they began to preach that and see that, that's where racism was eliminated and still being healed. But thank God, there's only one kind of slave we want to be. And that's a slave to the Lord Jesus Christ, where everybody.
I got to freeze right there. Ed, do you deny the reality of how the white church continued racism after slavery? How the Southern Baptist Convention, what they did? How, in his own sermon, he actually contradicts it by saying when he passed a church in South Carolina, they had a sign where everybody wasn't welcome. And he said, no, that's not how I'm going to be leading this church. Doc, come on. You can't sit here and talk about how the church was the one that led the end of slavery. No, it was white men like John Brown who stood up against other white pastors who wanted to continue. Come on, Doc. We can't do that. And y'all, so you hear what he does. And so what he does is he continues in here, and then he goes on and he closes his sermon by reciting King's I Have a Dream, the I Have a Dream portion of King's speech. And see, this is the crux of what I'm talking about. See, this is what I'm talking about, the game that these white conservative preachers play in terms of how they love to play around. See, Ed, since you want scripture, Proverbs 12:17 said, a truthful witness gives honest testimony, but a false witness tells lies. Then it says, reckless words pierce like a sword, but the tongue of the wise brings healing. Truthful lips endure forever, but a lying tongue lasts only a moment. There is a deceit in the heart of those who plot evil, but joy for those who promote peace. Ed, you can't stand in front of the people and then recite the I Have a Dream portion of Dr. King's speech, but you ignore completely everything he said before that. You can't sit here and talk about, oh, how Dr. King wanted the racists to get along and his children and what, y'all, he quote, and he starts crying and his congregation begins to stand up and they begin to clap and cheer and all that begins to happen. But how dare you as a Christian pastor give a 26-minute sermon extolling Dr. King? Not one time do you talk about what he stood against. Not one time do you recite the same speech where he talked about police brutality. He talked about voter suppression. He talked about the economic imbalance in this country. How can you sit here and even quote that particular speech that he gave at Southern Methodist University and totally look over the 6,000 other words he actually gave in the speech? Y'all, go to my iPad. If you actually look at the speech, Dr. King in the speech, he talks about the poor. He talks about voter suppression, still alive today. He talks about the economic imbalance when it comes to wages and jobs. He talks about all of those things. Yet I don't hear Ed Young talking about any of these issues. I don't hear him talking about what King was referencing. I don't hear him dealing with, in all of these volumes, the work King was talking about. Y'all go to YouTube. Ed Young has a speech called Socialism versus Capitalism, where he has some strong words against socialism. The same man who he praised in this sermon, guess what he called himself? A socialist. This book right here is called The Guaranteed Income. It is by Robert Theobald. This is the book. Reverend Al Sampson, who was one of two pastors personally ordained by Dr. King. This was the economic theory that the King believed in when it came to a guaranteed income. King said he was a socialist. But the same Ed Young has harsh words for socialists, yet he stands before the congregation, strips King of all of that to praise him, to make it sound like, oh, we all together. And if we could just love one another and just stand together. No, Ed, what it requires is for you to put some skin in the game. What it requires for you, Ed, is to not to drive your conservative theories when you at your church hosted Roy Moore Jr. when he was running against Doug Jones in the Alabama Senate. When you stood there and criticized the cash bail situation, blaming that for crime in the country, when you don't want to confront mass incarceration. Where are you, Ed Young, with the Poor People's Campaign and Reverend Dr. William J. Barber fighting for the 140 million poor and low income folks in the country? You You can't stand before the people and praise Dr. King and never mention the poor. You can't stand there and talk about how great and wonderful he was when literally the things that that man was fighting for then still exist today. You can't sit here and strip this man of who he was and how he spoke against the reality of how white folks thought. But maybe I just ought to just share just a couple of things, and I'm almost done. And I'm gonna let the panelists comment, and then I'm gonna go to my next guest. But I just want y'all to understand that, this is what King wrote. White Americans left the Negro on the ground and in devastating numbers walked off with the aggressor. It appeared that the white segregationists and the ordinary white citizen had more in common with one another than either had with the Negro. Same MLK. The same MLK, this is what he said. Overwhelmingly, America is still struggling with irresolution and contradiction. It has been sincere and even ardent in welcoming some change, but too quickly apathy and disinterest rise to the surface when the next logical steps are to be taken. Laws are passed in a crisis mood after a Birmingham or a Selma, but no substantial fervor survives the formal signing of legislation. The recording of the law in itself is treated as the reality of the reform. Same MLK, Ed Young. MLK writes, the real cost lies ahead. The stiffening of white resistance is a recognition of that fact. The discount education given Negroes will in the future have to be purchased at full price if quality education is to be realized. Jobs are harder and costlier to create than voting rolls. The eradication of slums housing millions is complex far beyond integrating buses and lunch counters. Same MLK. Same MLK. He then says in here, Negroes have proceeded from a premise that equality means what it says, and they have taken white Americans at their word when they talked of it as an objective. But most whites in America in 1967, including many persons of goodwill, proceed from a premise that equality is a loose expression for improvement. White America is not even psychologically organized to close the gap. Essentially, it seeks only to make it less painful and less obvious, but in most respects to retain it. Most of the abrasions between Negroes and white liberals arise from this fact. Same MLK, Ed Young. Same one. Then he says, whites, it must frankly be said, are not putting in a similar mass effort to re-educate themselves out of their racial ignorance. It is an aspect of their sense of superiority that the white people of America believe they have little to learn. Y'all, that's just in the first 10 pages of the book. I take exception to the sermon because what Ed Young is doing is what white Christians and white Republicans often do. That is, they want to present a sanitized, clean, saccharine, G-rated version of Dr. King minus all of the stuff that he was fighting for in his 39 years. You can't stand before your congregation, Ed Young, and praise Dr. King and how wonderful he was and how he preached the gospel if you never even mention the word poor. You can't stand there in your fine sanctuary and talk about how amazing he was and how he changed America if you're unwilling to commit yourself to the very things that he actually stood for. Because frankly, all you're doing, if you don't, is providing us with empty rhetoric that is meaningless. If Pastor Ed Young Sr. wants to impress me, I dare you to invite Reverend Dr. William J. Barber to your church. I dare you to invite the Poor People's Campaign and repairs of the breach. I dare you, Ed Young, to hold a 1 or 2 day conference on your campus with regards to the real life of Dr. King. I dare you to bring Reverend Bernice King to your church and the King Center and have a real dialogue. I dare you, Ed Young, to invite Reverend William Lawson and Reverend Dr. Ralph West and other pastors in Houston, the other black pastors in Houston, to come in and say how you, Ed Young, are willing to stand with them on the very issues that Dr. King talked about. Don't sit here and cherry pick out of a soul speech he gave at SMU if you're unwilling to address the other stuff he talked about in the very speech. Please, Ed Young, show me where you called out Senator Tommy Tuberville for his racist comments. Please show me where you have chastised Donald Trump, other Republicans, for their racist and xenophobic comments. Please show me where you are willing, at the age of 86, to stand in the same spot and say, I'm willing to lift up the same stuff Dr. King believed in. If not, all you did was give yourself a 26-minute pat on the back, shed some tears at the end, and got you an empty standing ovation from your audience, and they left that church just as uninformed as they were when you started. It's simple as that.
When we invest in ourselves, our glow, our vision, our vibe, we all shine. Together, we are black beyond measure.
Welcome to Atlanta, one of the most expensive housing markets in America. But rather than help out, Brian Kemp cashed in. He made hundreds of thousands of dollars in real estate. His net worth skyrocketed. And while Atlantans struggled to stay in their homes, Kemp gave $10,000 tax handouts to the richest Georgians and a nearly $700 million no-bid contract to his campaign donor. Brian Kickback Kemp, making Georgia work for him, not you.